Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove called her when the other residents were out of earshot, his voice carrying the particular contempt reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. Megan O'Brien had been working civilian medicine at Denver Mercy General for 8 months, and in 8 months she'd learned that the hospital operated on an invisible hierarchy that had nothing to do with skill or compassion. She wore scrubs like everyone else. She clocked in and out like everyone else. But somewhere between her first shift and her 173rd, she'd become a category, something to be managed, redirected, contained. The thing was, she was good at the job. Genuinely good. Her charting was meticulous in a way that made the charge nurse raise her eyebrows during peer reviews, every suture documented, every dressing change logged with timestamps down to the minute, every patient assessment written with the kind of precision that read less like nursing notes and more like legal testimony. Muscle memory, she told herself. The body remembers what the mind is ordered to forget. Her hands moved across the keyboard the same way they'd moved across a surgical field in Tikrit 8 years ago, with efficiency, with consequence, with the understanding that precision saved lives. Dr. Hargrove first noticed her during a routine post-operative check on a patient she'd prepped for abdominal reconstruction. The man's vitals were stable, his dressing intact, his pain managed at a 4 on the 10-point scale. Standard. Perfect. But Hargrove spent 14 minutes reviewing her chart notes before he even looked at the patient, his jaw tightening slightly with each page he scrolled. He was a tall man with the kind of face that photographed well, salt and pepper hair, expensive watch, the confidence of someone who'd never been told no and didn't plan to start. His power sat on him like cologne, the kind everyone could smell but pretended not to notice. "Your documentation is quite thorough," he said, not looking at her. The compliment landed like an accusation. "Thank you, Doctor." Megan kept her voice even, kept her eyes on the monitor displaying the patient's cardiac rhythm, steady sinus, 82 beats per minute, beautiful as a metronome. She'd learned to make her voice smaller in civilian spaces, to let it diminish into the background like she was furniture. Professional. Deferential. Nothing that would make anyone wonder where she'd really come from. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Hargrove had been billing that patient for a surgical implant that was never inserted, splitting a 30% kickback with a medical supply company in Phoenix that invoiced for phantom equipment across 5 different hospitals. 2 additional lucrative post-op cases, both of which she'd been assigned to care for, both of which she documented with the same meticulous precision that made every single phantom charge visible to anyone with eyes trained to see the gaps between billing records and actual procedures performed. By the end of that week, both patients had been reassigned. The first transfer happened on a Tuesday morning. A surgical team lead casually mentioned that the patient might do better with more experienced hands, which was administrator speak for something Megan understood perfectly. The second transfer came with slightly less pretense. Hargrove simply appeared at her station, made a note in the schedule system, and left without explanation. She'd cared for those men for barely 36 hours combined, but she'd documented every second of it. The other nurses noticed the pattern. Of course they did. Hospital floors operated on observation the way predators operate on scent. By Thursday, people stopped sitting near her in the break room. By Friday, the charge nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd been friendly enough during Megan's first few months, stopped making eye contact in the hallway. The isolation was so complete it was almost professional, which meant nobody could say she was being excluded. It just happened. The way water flows around a stone. Megan ate her lunch alone, reading articles on her phone about post-op infection protocols. Not because she was behind on anything, but because sitting alone made sense now. Less complicated. Her apartment was small, a 1-bedroom in a neighborhood that asked no questions, paid in cash, never seemed suspicious. She had a routine. Work, home, the park sometimes on her days off, nothing that required explanation or created witnesses. The invisibility wasn't new. It was just wearing a different uniform now. The combat boots were hidden in her locker behind her civilian coat, worn leather the color of old coffee, the sole scarred from gravel and blast dust that no amount of cleaning would fully remove. She touched them sometimes before her shift, just her fingertips against the leather, a 5-second acknowledgement of a life that technically didn't exist anymore. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien was dead. Officially, legally, somewhere in a Pentagon file sealed so deep that even Hargrove's network of private school connections and country club favors couldn't reach it. Here at Denver Mercy General, she was just Megan, RN, 8 months employed, unremarkable, quiet. But hands that had performed needle decompression on collapsed lungs while shells detonated 30 meters away didn't forget how to work. Eyes that had tracked vital signs in a field hospital running on diesel fumes and determination didn't stop seeing patterns in data. And a mind that had been trained by people whose names she still couldn't say didn't accidentally create 17 pages of documentation that outlined exactly where a doctor's billing fraud had begun. Hargrove pulled her chart audits on a Wednesday evening, after the day shift had cleared and the night nurses were just settling into their rhythm. He called them up on his personal laptop in his office, the office with the door that locked and the windows that faced away from the floor, and went through them with the expression of a man watching a building burn down. Her documentation style was distinctive. Obsessive. The kind of charting that could only come from someone who understood that paperwork was evidence, that precision was armor, that the written word could protect the innocent and expose the guilty with equal, indifferent force. 3 months of her work. 92 patients. 214 phantom charges that now had a paper trail leading directly back to his kickback scheme. The supply company wouldn't move product without a purchase order matched to a procedure. The procedure wouldn't be logged without nursing documentation. The nursing documentation wouldn't exist without someone actually touching that patient, noting what they actually found, writing down what was actually done. She'd written down what was actually done. He stared at her name on the charts, O'Brien, RN, every entry time-stamped and signed with the kind of signature that looked like someone was writing their own legal deposition. The kind of signature that would survive a federal investigation. The kind of signature that was destroying him in real time, one meticulous note at a time. What happened next would set everything in motion. The bulletin board was mounted at eye level, exactly where everyone passed during shift change. Dr. Hargrove positioned himself in front of it at 7:19 a.m., clipboard in hand, while a patient's entire family waited 15 feet away to be admitted to the ICU. The write-up was printed in bold, improper wound closure technique, requires remediation. Megan's name centered below like a headline. He read it aloud, voice carrying across the unit with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. Ms. O'Brien seems to think her creative methods are acceptable in a professional facility. They are not. His jaw was tight, shoulders squared, a man performing dominance for an audience. The family stared. A nurse stopped charting. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like witnesses. Megan stood 5 feet away, hand steady on the medication cart. She'd heard him the first time. She took one measured breath through her nose, let a single tear escape, just one, deliberate as a surgical incision, which she wiped away without breaking eye contact. The room went silent. She looked directly at Hargrove and said, "The sutures will hold, and the scar will fade. Some wounds are designed that way." Her voice was level, controlled, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The patient's son leaned toward his father. Hargrove's face darkened. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked away. That silence lasted 3 seconds. Then a nurse whispered something to another. The moment was over, but something had shifted in the air like ozone after a defibrillator fires. The break room was painted institutional beige, fluorescent lit, with a refrigerator that hummed a low mechanical song. Megan sat at the corner table during her lunch break with a sandwich she'd made that morning, turkey, mustard, no mayo. She unwrapped it slowly. Within 30 seconds, Janet stood, grabbed her yogurt. Then Marcus gathered his coffee. Then Chen and Williams rose almost simultaneously, their movement synchronized like a choreographed retreat. The fifth nurse, a respiratory therapist named Kevin, paused at the door and whispered, "Hargrove said anyone seen with staff under review might be next." "I'm sorry." Then he left too. The door swung shut with a soft pneumatic hiss. Megan sat alone in the fluorescent buzz, her sandwich untouched in front of her, her hand steady on the table, but the isolation felt like pressure in a sealed chamber. She didn't taste the food when she finally ate. She barely swallowed. By Wednesday, Hargrove had escalated. He brought her into room for 12 during family visitation hours, a calculated move, surgical in its timing. A post-op patient lay in bed, incision dressed that morning by Megan's hands. Hargrove gestured toward the wound dressing with the flourish of someone revealing evidence. This is what happens when we let unqualified staff handle complex cases. Nurse O'Brien, perhaps you should stick to taking temperatures. The patient's son, a man in his 40s with arms like a linebacker, said, "Is she actually unqualified?" Hargrove smiled, and it was the smile of a predator testing prey. "Let's just say her credentials are questionable." The words hung like poison gas. Megan stood perfectly still, took one breath, and replied, "The infection rate on my patients is 0%. I'll let the work speak." She turned and walked out of the room without waiting for his response. In the hallway, alone, her hands trembled against her thighs for 4 seconds, then stopped. She pressed her palms against her scrubs pocket where she kept the challenge coin, cold, metal, real, and walked toward the next patient. The real nightmare began on her lunch break, Thursday, at Washington Park 3 blocks from Mercy General. She'd needed air, space, distance from the fluorescent hum and Hargrove's manufactured disappointment. She sat on a wooden bench with a sandwich she barely touched, watching children chase each other near the playground equipment while their parents filmed on phones. The Denver skyline was visible beyond the trees, sharp against a cloudless sky. Near the far playground, an elderly man in a faded Army Ranger baseball cap walked a golden retriever with methodical patience, the gait of someone trained to cover distance efficiently. He was maybe 70, maybe older, his hands weathered like old leather. The dog stopped to sniff a tree. The man clutched his chest. His legs folded. He went down onto the grass in a controlled collapse, like someone who'd rehearsed falling and did it right. His lips turned blue within seconds. Not gradually, fast. Megan's brain processed it in parallel streams, blue lips, no chest rise on the right side, his head tilted back, mouth open like he was trying to swallow sky. A jogger screamed. 3 people pulled out phones, 2 dialing 911, 1 recording, because the world filmed trauma now instead of acting. Megan sprinted across the park, her trainers slapping the path, closing the distance in 8 seconds flat. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands already moving, muscle memory taking over. Unilateral chest rise. Tracheal deviation. Distended neck veins like cords straining against his skin. Tension pneumothorax. His right lung was collapsing. His heart was being crushed in its own cage. Paramedics were 7 minutes out minimum. He would be dead in 4. She yanked a ballpoint pen from her scrubs pocket, always carried one for charting, and unscrewed it with the speed of someone who'd done this under mortar fire in Tikrit. The hollow casing was maybe 2 inches long, surgical clean. She felt for the second intercostal space, the gap between his ribs, pressed her fingers into the anatomy she'd learned in a classroom 1,000 years ago. The skin was warm, soft, alive. She positioned the pen casing perpendicular to his chest wall and drove it between his ribs with the precision of someone who'd operated on patients bleeding out in fight conditions while taking rounds overhead. The hiss of air escaping was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. His collapsed lung reinflated in real time. His chest rose. Color flooded back into his face like someone was turning up the saturation on a photograph. His mouth opened wider, gasped, took air that actually reached his lungs. The crowd gasped. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Someone else said, "Is she a doctor?" Megan held pressure on the wound with her left hand while monitoring his breathing with her right. One hand on his chest, feeling his lungs expand, feeling him come back from the edge. "He needs a chest tube," she said quietly to the jogger. "Call it into Mercy General, Trauma Bay. Tell them it's a pneumothorax, needle decompression performed, patient stable." Her voice was different now, not the careful, deferential nurse from the hospital. This was command voice. This was the person who'd run a surgical field hospital under fire. The jogger nodded and relayed the message. Paramedics arrived in 6 minutes, sirens wailing like wolves in the distance, closer, louder, then here. The lead medic, a woman with kind eyes and a practiced efficiency, knelt beside the elderly man. "Who performed the decompression?" she asked, stunned. "I did," Megan said quietly. "Approximately 3 minutes ago. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Pen casing. He'll need a tube and imaging." The medic stared at her for 1 full second. Then she began loading the patient onto the stretcher, calling vitals into the radio, already in motion. The elderly man, later identified as Sergeant Major William Cross, retired Army Ranger, for tours in Tikrit, was wheeled into the ambulance. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close. Someone in the crowd of onlookers had been recording. Someone else had recognized the Mercy General logo on Megan's ID badge. And someone, a person with the kind of social connections that made them dangerous, had called Dr. Hargrove's friend, the hospital board president, before Megan had even finished wiping the man's blood from her hands. The story that arrived at Mercy General wasn't heroic nurse saves dying patient in park. It was rogue nurse performs invasive surgical procedure on civilian without authorization or equipment or proper medical supervision. Megan returned to the unit at 1:15 p.m. The atmosphere had changed. Nurses avoided her eyes. A junior resident whispered something to an attending and they both stopped talking when she passed. By 2 p.m., Hargrove had requested a meeting. By 2:45 p.m., she would walk out of that hospital with her life in a cardboard box and no explanation beyond pending review. But right now, at 1:24 p.m., she didn't know any of that yet. She was simply grateful the elderly man was alive. She was simply trying to process the muscle memory that had surfaced unbidden, the training that was supposed to stay buried. She was simply trying not to think about how naturally her hands had moved, how the field surgery had come back to her like a language she'd never stopped speaking. The next conversation came during a routine dressing change at 2:10 p.m. Megan was in room 307 with an elderly patient who'd been transferred from another facility that morning, a visiting patient, temporary stay, routine wound care. She was changing his post-op dressing with the same meticulous technique that had gotten her written up, the same careful precision that was somehow both her greatest strength and her most dangerous liability. The patient watched her hands work. Watched them move with certainty, with knowledge, with the specific muscle memory of someone trained in emergency field conditions. His eyes narrowed. He whispered, "That's a Tikrit stitch. Where does civilian nurse learn field surgery?" The room went completely silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Megan's hands kept working. She didn't pause. She didn't look at him. She didn't break eye contact. She simply continued dressing the wound with the same methodical precision, her face expressionless while inside her chest, her classified past threatened to surface like a body weighted and sunk in deep water, rising now, unstoppable, returning to air. The elderly man collapsed near the playground on her lunch break, his body folding against the autumn grass like something had cut his strings. One moment he was walking past the sandbox at Washington Park, the next his knees buckled and he went down hard, his face already turning the color of wet cement. The crowd gathered the way crowds always do, phones emerging before understanding, voices loud with the kind of panic that makes everything worse. A mother pulled her child away. A jogger stopped running. 3 people dialed 911 simultaneously, each one speaking over the others, creating a chorus of alarm that bounced off the brick buildings bordering the park. Megan saw it before anyone else saw it. The way his left side wasn't moving. The absence of breath on that side of his chest. The blue creeping up from his fingertips like someone was filling him with ink. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing on the heart, collapsing the other lung, filling the chest cavity with air that had nowhere to go. 3 to 5 minutes before cardiac arrest. Maybe less. She was off duty, in civilian clothes, eating a salad she hadn't wanted in a break room she'd started avoiding because the other nurses left whenever she sat down. But muscle memory didn't care about duty status. Her hands moved before her brain finished the thought. She dropped to her knees beside him, her fingers already moving, assessing, measuring, reading the landscape of his ribs the way a musician reads sheet music. The crowd's noise faded into something distant and muffled. There was only the man, his gasping breath, his heart doing a frantic tap dance against ribs that were collapsing inward like a building folding in on itself. She needed a needle. 14 gauge, at least. She needed the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She needed 30 seconds and absolute stillness in her hands. She had none of those things. What she had was a pen. A Bic ballpoint someone had dropped on the bench beside her, plastic blue, the kind that cost 99 cents at a CVS. She snapped the barrel with a sharp crack, the sound cutting through the crowd's noise like a gunshot, and stripped the ink tube and internal mechanisms, leaving only the hollow plastic shaft. The pen casing was smaller than she would have chosen. It was also all she had. She'd done this before under mortar fire in Tikrit, in a field hospital with sand in her teeth and incoming rounds turning the building's concrete skin to dust. She could do it with a pen. She had to. "I need everyone to step back," she said. Her voice had changed without her permission, dropped an octave, become something that sounded like gravel and authority. The crowd obeyed. People were good about obeying when a voice sounded like it had seen things. She found the space between his ribs, the second intercostal space, her hands reading his anatomy like Braille. His skin was cool and getting cooler, sweat pooling in the hollow of his collarbone. She felt for the landmarks, the ridge of his rib, calculated the angle, and pushed. The needle went in with a slight resistance, then a give. There was a moment of nothing. Then the hiss. Air escaping from a cavity that had been sealed, pressure releasing like opening a door someone had been holding shut from the other side. The sound was small and huge at the same time, the sound of pressure equalizing, of a lung re-inflating, of a man's body remembering how to breathe. His eyes went wide. His body convulsed once, violently, and then his chest expanded. Both sides. Moving now. Air moving. Life moving back into him from the place where it was leaving. His lips were still blue, but they were darkening now. The blue was receding. O2 saturation climbing in his blood, oxygen molecules finally finding their way back into red cells that had been starving for it. She kept her hand on the pen casing, kept it steady, kept it exactly where it was while his body reorganized itself around breathing, around living, around the sudden realization that he was going to make it. The playground behind them was silent now. Even the children had stopped playing. The paramedics arrived in 3 minutes, their sirens pulling the world back into focus. They came running through the park with their equipment and their training and their confident movements, and they stopped when they saw what she'd done. The senior paramedic, a woman with grey at her temples and the kind of eyes that had seen a lot, looked at the pen casing, looked at Megan's steady hand, and did not ask questions. Instead she nodded, a small, significant movement that said she understood exactly what had happened here and why a civilian in yoga pants had just saved a man's life with a plastic pen. Needle decompression, Megan said quietly. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular. Tension pneumothorax. He was circling. The paramedic moved in without hesitation, took over the care with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, but her eyes flicked back to Megan once with something that looked like recognition. Not of her identity, that wasn't possible. But of her competence. Of the military precision in her hands. Of something that ran deeper than a civilian nurse's training. They loaded the man onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency, and as they wheeled him toward the ambulance, his eyes found hers. He was conscious now, struggling for breath, but conscious. Alive. The color in his face was coming back like someone was slowly turning up a dimmer switch. "Thank you," he gasped. The words were barely audible, torn from a throat that had just fought its way back from the edge. Megan nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and stepped back as the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance. The crowd dispersed gradually, people returning to their phones, to their children, to their afternoon, the crisis passing into memory with the speed that civilian life moved. A crisis that lasted 3 minutes, a moment that would reshape everything, but they didn't know that yet. She was still standing in the grass when the ambulance pulled away, its lights painting the autumn trees red and blue. Her heart was still elevated, still running on the adrenaline of the emergency, still operating in the part of her that belonged to a different life. The part that was trained for moments like this. The part that should never have been trained for anything. She picked up her abandoned salad, found the park bench, sat down as if this was just another lunch break, as if she hadn't just saved a man's life with a pen in front of 36 witnesses who now knew, definitively, that she was something other than just a nurse. But that wasn't the worst part. By the time she returned to Mercy General for her evening shift, Dr. Hargrove had already heard about what happened at the park. He'd made his first call to the hospital board president, a man whose daughter's wedding he'd attended 2 years ago. He was planting seeds now, careful seeds, poisonous seeds. Unauthorized field procedure, he said, his voice smooth as oil. Practicing medicine without a license. Liability nightmare. By the second call, to the state nursing board, the story had evolved. By the third call, to an investigator named Marcus Tully who specialized in burying inconvenient staff members, the narrative was fully formed: a nurse with suspicious gaps in her employment history, unverifiable credentials, a record that didn't add up. He was building a cage while she was still standing in the park with autumn leaves in her hair, still tasting adrenaline, still trying to figure out how to go back to being invisible in a room where everyone had just watched her do the impossible. The pen casing was in her pocket, still cold, still carrying the weight of a life saved and a secret exposed. She didn't know yet that Hargrove was burning his network. She didn't know that by the time she clocked in for her evening shift, the security guards would be waiting. She didn't know that the cardboard box was already being brought up from storage. She knew only that she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that she'd revealed something about herself that she'd been ordered to bury, and that in trying to save one man's life, she'd put her own in a collision course with exposure. The fluorescent lights of the hospital parking lot hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass as she pulled in, their cold white glow making everything look like it existed in a photograph rather than in real time. She grabbed her badge from the passenger seat, the small plastic rectangle that authorized her to walk these halls, to touch these patients, to be who she'd promised the Navy she would pretend to be. Civilian. Invisible. A nurse named Megan who had no past and no skills beyond what a nursing school could teach. As she walked toward the entrance, a text came through on her phone from an unknown number: "Thank you." That was Army Ranger training. I'd recognize it anywhere. She stopped walking, her hand freezing on the door handle. The message came from a blocked number. No sender ID. Just words that said someone knew exactly what she was. Someone had been watching. Someone understood that what they'd seen in the park wasn't textbook CPR, it was combat medicine, field surgery under pressure, the kind of precision that only came from years of operating under fire in places like Tikrit, in field hospitals that didn't exist on any map. She deleted the message and opened the door. The evening shift was waiting. Mercy General's fluorescent hall stretched in front of her like a tunnel. And somewhere in a hospital room above her, an elderly man was fighting to stay alive on a ventilator, his lungs slowly re-inflating, his blood finally carrying oxygen to cells that had been starving. He would live. The decision to save him had been automatic, non-negotiable. The cost of saving him was everything else. The call came through at 2:14 p.m., while Megan was still in the break room, her scrub still damp from the park, her hand still remembering the feel of a collapsed lung re-inflating under her fingers. Dr. Hargrove stood in his office on the 3rd floor, phone pressed to his ear, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. On the other end of the line was Richard Ashford, president of Mercy General's Board of Trustees, a man whose daughter's wedding Hargrove had attended 6 months earlier, a wedding where Hargrove had spent 45 minutes discussing tax shelters and investment opportunities with Ashford's brother-in-law, a gesture that had felt like planting seeds in very fertile ground. "Richard, we have a situation," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the rehearsed calm of a man used to getting his way. "One of our nurses performed an unauthorized medical procedure in a public space without proper oversight. Needle decompression. On a civilian. No documentation, no supervision, no hospital protocols followed." The pause on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. "A life was saved, James." A life was saved by someone whose credentials may not be what they appear to be, Hargrove countered, his voice like a scalpel finding soft tissue. We need to protect the hospital from liability. That's where I'm recommending immediate investigation and removal pending credential verification. He hung up before Ashford could respond, already dialing the state nursing board, his finger moving with the mechanical precision of a man executing a plan he'd already rehearsed. The woman who answered identified herself as Patricia Huang, supervisor of licensure investigations. Hargrove introduced himself as chief of surgery at Mercy General, his authority implicit in every syllable. I'm calling to report serious concerns about one of our nursing staff members, he said, his tone carrying the weight of a man protecting public safety. Megan O'Brien. She's performed advanced medical procedures without appropriate authorization, and I've discovered irregularities in her credentialing documentation that concern me greatly. What kind of irregularities? Huang asked, professional but interested. Her prior employment records are incomplete. There are gaps in her work history between 2014 and 2019. No verifiable references from that period. When I pressed her on it, she became evasive. In my clinical judgment, that's a red flag for someone who may have falsified her nursing certifications. It was a masterpiece of insinuation, technically true facts arranged in a false architecture, built to suggest fraud without stating it outright. Hargrove had learned this technique years ago. Implication leaves less fingerprints than accusation. We'll need to open a full investigation, Huang said, and Hargrove could hear the shift in her tone, the sudden carefulness of bureaucracy protecting itself. 20 minutes later, Hargrove was on the phone with Marcus Webb, an independent credentialing investigator he'd worked with before, a man who understood how institutional problems could be solved quietly if you knew the right questions to ask and, more importantly, which questions to avoid asking. Webb had helped him before when a radiologist's substance abuse issues threatened to become public, and Hargrove had been very generous with his referrals afterward. Marcus, I need a credential review on one of our nurses. Megan O'Brien. I need it fast and I need it thorough. How thorough? Webb asked, and in those two words was an understanding of what Hargrove actually meant. Thorough enough that if there's anything questionable about her background, we find it. If there's nothing to find, we document that too. But I suspect we'll find something. What Hargrove couldn't know was that they wouldn't find anything, not because there was nothing to find, but because some record simply didn't exist outside of classified networks that no private investigator could access. Megan's file had been scrubbed with the precision of a surgical team removing a malignancy, her service in Tikrit reduced to phantom entries in databases that no longer connected to any real identity. Those for years were a void in the civilian record, a gap that looked like fraud because it was designed to look like fraud, camouflage so perfect that honest investigation would make it look worse. By 3:48 p.m., Hargrove had orchestrated the machinery of institutional destruction. The hospital's legal team, acting on his recommendations, had initiated a credential suspension pending investigation. Security had been notified. The board would be briefed at their next meeting, where Hargrove would present himself as the whistleblower who'd caught a potential threat before it harmed the hospital. At 4:22 p.m., Megan was called into the HR office on the second floor. The woman behind the desk, Sandra Corbin, HR director, wouldn't make eye contact. Beside her sat James Chen from security, his uniform pressing against the chair like a man trying to disappear into furniture. Megan, we need to place you on immediate administrative leave pending a full credential investigation, Sandra said, sliding a manila envelope across the desk. This is effective immediately. We'll need your badge and access credentials. Megan didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply looked at the envelope, then back at Sandra, her face a study in absolute stillness. I performed a life-saving procedure on a member of the public, Megan said, her voice level and quiet. That's not grounds for an investigation. Dr. Hargrove has raised concerns about gaps in your employment history and the unauthorized nature of the medical intervention, Sandra replied, finally meeting her eyes. We have a responsibility to verify your credentials before you return to patient care. James Chen stood, a gesture that wasn't quite hostile but was unmistakably final. Megan understood the language. She'd heard it before in different uniforms, in different rooms, when extraction came with a polite excuse instead of a boot through a door. She didn't argue. That wasn't her style. She stood, removed her badge, the one that said Mercy Generals with her name and the small blue square indicating full hospital access, and set it on Sandra's desk with the gentleness of placing something precious in a grave. Then she walked to her locker in the break room, the fluorescent lights humming their electric dirge overhead, and began removing 8 months of her life into a cardboard box that someone had thoughtfully prepared. Family photos. A spare pair of scrubs. The nursing journal she kept with clinical notes. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag to hide them from casual observation, the pair of worn combat boots, size 10, with the original Army Ranger patch still stitched inside the heel. She'd never been able to throw them away. They were museum pieces of a life that had officially ceased to exist, museum pieces that now felt like evidence at a crime scene. The walk through the ICU felt like moving through water. Every nurse she'd trained with, every tech she'd worked beside during double shifts, every person who'd accepted her coffee runs and her quiet competence, they all looked away. Not unkindly. Just away. Hargrove had whispered his warnings, and institutional self-preservation was a virus that spread fast. She made it to her car in the parking lot, sat in the driver's seat with the cardboard box on her lap, and let herself cry for 90 seconds. Not longer. Never longer. Pain was information, and this information told her that she'd made a tactical error the moment she'd put her hands on that man in the park. She'd revealed herself. She'd stepped out of the shadows, and the shadows had closed behind her like a closing fist. At 3:36 p.m., her daughter Lily found her at the kitchen table in their small apartment on Downing Street, still in scrubs, still crying into her hands in a way that Lily had seen before but had learned never to question. "Mommy." Lily's voice was small, careful, the voice of a child who'd learned to read the temperature of her mother's pain. "Why are you home so early?" Megan looked up, tried to smile, and couldn't. Her daughter's eyes were the same grey-blue as her own, and they saw too much, understood too much for a 7-year-old who'd spent her life watching her mother disappear into uniforms and sealed buildings. "Did you get fired?" Lily whispered, and the directness of it, the way children cut through pretense like a blade, broke something in Megan's chest. She pulled Lily into her lap, held her against the scrubs that smelled like hospital disinfectant and her own sweat, and didn't answer because any answer would be a lie. Instead, she buried her face in her daughter's hair and held on to the only thing in her life that had never been classified, never been erased, never been taken away. 2 miles away, in the ICU at Mercy General, Sergeant Major William Cross regained consciousness at 4:33 p.m., the sedation wearing off in layers, awareness returning like a signal strengthening on a radio receiver. His lung was re-inflated. His oxygen saturation was 96%. His heart rate was strong and steady at 71 beats per minute, the metrics of a life saved. The nurse at his bedside was charting vitals when his hand moved, his voice emerging rough but clear, "Who saved me?" The nurse, a woman named Patricia, 8 years on the job, unfamiliar with the specific authority that came from 30 years of military command, checked his chart. A nurse named Megan O'Brien. She performed an emergency needle decompression in the park. Probably saved your life. "Where is she now?" Cross asked, and something in his tone made Patricia's spine straighten. "She works here." Well, worked. She was terminated today. The word terminated hung in the air like a weapon discharged. Cross's eyes, despite the lingering effects of sedation, sharpened into focus. He'd seen field medicine in for combat zones. He'd been treated by corpsmen under fire, and he knew the difference between competence and mastery. What that woman had done in the park, a decompression with a pen casing, the kind of precision that came from doing it under mortar fire, that wasn't something you learned in a hospital. "I need her file," Cross said, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of command, even in a hospital bed, even weakened and catheterized. "Full file. Everything." "Sir, patient privacy laws," Patricia began, but Cross cut her off. "That woman performed a combat medical procedure on me with nothing but a pen and the knowledge of someone who's done it before. I need her file, or I need someone who will get it for me. Patricia hesitated, then left the room. When she returned 40 minutes later, it was with a folder that she set on his bedside table with visible reluctance. Inside were 8 months of documentation, Megan's civilian nursing credentials, her employment history, her performance reviews from Mercy General, all of it immaculate and simultaneously useless as actual proof of who she was. But Cross didn't need the file to know. He'd heard it in her hands. He'd seen it in the way she'd moved, the way she'd known exactly where to place the needle, the way she'd kept him talking to assess his neurological status while her fingers were doing something he'd only seen in forward surgical units in Iraq. He picked up his phone, still in his personal items, still charged, and made a call to a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years. The man who answered was an admiral, or had been before his retirement, and was now something less official and considerably more connected. "Admiral, it's Cross. I need a favor. I need someone's military records unsealed." There was a pause. "What kind of military?" "Navy. Special warfare." "And Cross, the records are going to be classified." "Combat medic. Secret area of operations. 2016 to 2018, approximately." The pause lasted longer this time. "I'm going to need a name and a very good reason. The name is Megan O'Brien. And the reason is she saved my life and someone's trying to destroy her because they don't know who she actually is." In the silence that followed, Cross could hear the distant sound of a helicopter passing over the hospital, a UH-60 Black Hawk, probably the same aircraft that had carried him into combat zones a dozen times. In that moment, in that hospital room, with a collapsed lung that had been saved by field medicine performed under fluorescent lights instead of desert stars, Sergeant Major William Cross smiled for the first time since regaining consciousness. "I'll make some calls," the Admiral said. "This is going to be interesting." The FBI liaison's words still hung in the conference room like cordite smoke. "Federal investigation. Sealed records. Operations that saved 17 American lives but were never supposed to be acknowledged." Dr. Hargrove sat motionless in his leather chair, watching his network of favors dissolve in real time like paper in gasoline. The board president who'd taken his call 72 hours earlier now sat in a federal interview room explaining how he'd been misled by a trusted colleague. The words felt like a knife in Hargrove's back because they came from the man he'd personally placed on the hospital foundation board, the man whose daughter's wedding Hargrove had attended, whose law firm had represented the hospital's interests for 17 years. That same man was now throwing him overboard to save himself. Marcus Tully, the outside investigator Hargrove had called to question Megan's credentials, turned over emails within 24 hours of being contacted by federal agents. Tully's entire reputation depended on maintaining plausible deniability. One phone call from the FBI and his loyalty evaporated like morning fog. The emails were damning, Hargrove's request that Tully look carefully at Megan's background, the specific concerns about her inconsistent history, the implication that something didn't add up. On paper, it looked like a colleague following protocol. To the federal agents reading those same emails, it looked like orchestrated character assassination. The state nursing board complaint was withdrawn with an official apology to Megan issued through the hospital's legal department. No explanation. No fanfare. Just a single sentence acknowledging that the concerns had been determined to be without merit based on subsequent investigation. Hargrove's network collapsed in reverse order, each person he'd activated now scrambling to distance themselves like passengers on a sinking ship. The supply company CEO who'd shared those kickback arrangements suddenly couldn't remember details. The board members who'd nodded along to his concerns now claimed they'd been uninformed about the full picture. His phone stopped ringing. His calls went to voicemail. The community he'd built through years of dinner parties and careful favor trading abandoned him with the efficiency of seawater draining from a bathtub. Within 5 days, the chief of staff completed an internal audit and found $340,000 in fraudulent billing spread across 18 months. Procedures coded but never performed. Equipment invoiced but never delivered. Phantom surgeries with real patient names. The pattern was so obvious once someone looked that auditors later admitted the documentation trail had been there for anyone willing to examine it, and Megan's meticulous charting had created an audit trail so precise, so detailed, that hiding became impossible once federal eyes started reading. 3 patients came forward describing surgeries they'd been charged for but never received. One woman had called the hospital billing department asking why she'd been charged $8,400 for a shoulder arthroscopy when her records showed conservative treatment only. That conversation, when reviewed by investigators, became Exhibit A. The patient had actually saved the voicemail from the billing clerk, a recording of a confused administrator trying to explain why the computer showed a procedure that hadn't happened. The medical supply company CEO, facing federal prison time, folded like origami. He confirmed Hargrove's 40% kickback arrangement in a signed statement in exchange for immunity. 40%. On phantom equipment orders. On supplies that never shipped to never treated patients. The mathematics of fraud laid bare in a spreadsheet that prosecutors printed in triplicate. Hargrove was escorted from the building by the same security director who'd removed Megan weeks earlier. The escort happened on a Tuesday afternoon around 3 o'clock when the hospital was busy enough that staff noticed but not so busy that everyone stopped working. Hargrove walked out with a cardboard box containing his personal items, a framed diploma, a collection of medical journals, family photos from his desk. No one watched him leave. No one said goodbye. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal mechanical song as he crossed the lobby for what would be the last time as a physician with hospital privileges. His medical license was suspended pending criminal investigation. His hospital privileges were revoked across the entire state network through the Colorado Medical Board. His professional reputation, the thing he'd cultivated like a precious garden, was destroyed in the same medical community where he'd once wielded social power like a crowned king. Doctors who'd attended his dinner parties, who'd deferred to his seniority, who'd laughed at his jokes during surgical conferences, those same doctors now refused his calls. One colleague actually returned his phone call just to confirm he was on the FBI's witness list and wouldn't be speaking to him anymore. The state medical board leaked his case number to a healthcare fraud watchdog blog. Within days, his name appeared in national news articles about corruption in medical billing. Denver doctor faces federal charges in $340,000 fraud scheme. The headline appeared in medical journals and national news outlets simultaneously. His photograph, taken from his hospital credentials, circulated alongside the story. His children saw it. His ex-wife called to say she was changing her phone number. His attorney negotiated desperately for some version of a plea deal that wouldn't involve prison, but the prosecutors had 17 years of fraudulent billing and the medical supply CEO's testimony. The deal that finally came through required 5 years of federal prison, restitution to patients, and permanent loss of his medical license. 6 months later, someone from Mercy General spotted him teaching CPR basics at Community College Denver, teaching chest compression techniques to nursing students and paramedic trainees for minimum wage. His hands shook slightly as he demonstrated cardiac massage on a plastic dummy named Resusciani. His eyes were hollow, the kind of hollow that comes from losing your identity. He wore the college's khaki polo shirt and name tag instead of the white coat he'd worn for 32 years. During the break between classes, he sat alone in the faculty lounge staring at a cup of black coffee, untouched and cooling. A student asked him why he'd left clinical practice. He said only, "I made mistakes," then excused himself to the bathroom where no one could see him anymore. But that wasn't the final chapter. That was the countdown to it. Megan was reinstated to Mercy General with full back pay, a formal apology from the hospital board signed by the board president himself, and an offer to design and lead the new trauma response training program, teaching other nurses the field techniques she'd once been forbidden to mention. The reinstatement letter was dated exactly 3 months after her firing. The back pay check was substantially larger than expected because it included accrued vacation time and the shift differential she would have earned had she worked nights during those 3 months. The training director position came with a 17% salary increase and the authority to restructure how the entire emergency department trained on field trauma protocols. Sergeant Major Cross attended the reinstatement ceremony in his dress uniform, his chest bearing the weight of 28 years of service and decorations earned in places most people would never know the names of. He stood beside Megan while the hospital's chief of staff read a statement acknowledging the hospital's error, its failure to protect an exemplary employee, and its commitment to fostering an environment of trust and respect for all medical professionals. Cross waited until that statement finished, then turned to the assembled staff, doctors, nurses, administrators, the board members who'd met in that conference room weeks earlier, and spoke with the clarity of someone accustomed to being heard. I've served with the best this country has to offer. In the Army Rangers. In operations most of you will never know about. And I'm here to tell you that Senior Chief O'Brien stands among them. His voice carried the weight of a command. His eyes moved across the room. Some of us were saved by her hands. Some of you were saved by her thinking. And all of us will benefit from learning what she knows. He extended his hand to Megan. She took it. The room gave them the only thing that mattered, silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of judgment, but the heavy, respectful silence of recognition. Lily had drawn a picture of a nurse with angel wings taped inside Megan's locker, right next to the mirror where Megan checked her appearance before shifts. The drawing was crayon and construction paper, the artistic capability of a 7-year-old rendered in primary colors and uneven lines. But the detail in the wings was precise. The child had taken time with those wings. Above the drawing, on a shelf beside civilian shoes, Megan now placed her worn combat boots openly displayed. No longer hidden in a cardboard box under her bed. No longer buried like evidence of a life she had to forget. The boots became something of a legend among the younger nurses, who whispered stories about the quiet woman who'd lived 2 lives, who'd been erased by her government and then brought back by a veteran who recognized her hands. On her first shift back, a new surgical resident made a dismissive comment about civilian nurses while discussing protocol changes in the staff room. The words came out casual, confident, the kind of comment that usually landed like gravity, unquestioned and uncontested. An attending physician who'd been present in the conference room during the reveal interrupted with the kind of sharp precision that makes people straighten up. That civilian nurse has a Navy Cross and more combat trauma experience than this entire residency program combined. Show respect. The resident's face changed temperature. The room shifted. No one made dismissive comments about Megan again. The hospital installed a small bronze plaque in the emergency department in honor of those who serve in silence. Megan ran her fingers over it once during her 3rd shift back, feeling the raised lettering under her calloused hands. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply acknowledged the weight of it, the recognition of the invisible service that had brought her here. Then she turned and got back to work. During a late-night code 7 weeks into her reinstatement, a young nurse panicked during a difficult intubation. The patient was a 53-year-old woman in cardiogenic shock, her oxygen saturation dropping, her airway increasingly difficult to secure. The resident was sweating through his gloves. The respiratory therapist was running through their backup equipment. The young nurse, barely past her orientation, froze at the bedside, overwhelmed by the volume of simultaneous critical needs. She looked like someone drowning while standing in the middle of dry land. Megan placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Not a command. A connection. She spoke quietly, voice pitched low so the words landed as instruction, not judgment. Breathe. You've got this. Some of us were forged in fire, but we all learned to carry the heat. The nurse took a breath. Steadied. Resumed documenting vital signs with the precision that matters in a code. The young woman would later say that 3 seconds of contact with Megan O'Brien changed how she thought about crisis management. That pressure, that calm, that confidence, it was transferable. It could be learned. As Megan drove home that night, Lily asleep in the back seat with her face pressed against the window, Megan thought about the words she'd told Hargrove months ago during that brutal public humiliation on the unit board. The sutures will hold, and the scar will fade, some wounds are designed that way. She'd been talking about herself. The sutures were holding. The scarring was fading into something stronger than skin. And yes, some wounds are designed that way, designed to teach you what you're capable of enduring. Designed to prove you've already survived the worst. She whispered to the empty car, to the ghost of who she'd been and who she was becoming. True class is what you do when the lights go out. The camera would have held on her combat boots in the locker one final time, the worn leather catching the fluorescent light like a story told in absence, proof that some warriors never stop serving. They just change uniforms. They just learn new ways to carry the weight. They just keep breathing. They just keep their hands steady. They just keep going home to their daughters and drawing pictures of angels and knowing, finally knowing, that the world had seen them at last. If you're enjoying this, smash that like button. And answer me this: would you have signed the NDA and taken the money, or fought back? Comments are open.